For decades, the Maowusu was just sand, not desert the way postcards make deserts look, not dramatic red dunes or sweeping golden waves. It was gray, loose, dead, a landscape that had forgotten what it meant to hold water. Villages buried under drifts that arrived without warning, farmland scraped clean by winds that didn't stop. And then, between 2000 and 2020, something almost impossible happened. Roughly 1,000 square kilometers of that sand turned green every single year. Not slowly, not reluctantly, year after year, like a machine that had finally been switched on. And the question nobody outside of China really asks, the question that actually matters, is what exactly flipped that switch? I'm Tom Marsh, and this is the story of how 800,000 rabbits, a grass nobody wanted, and a government program that almost nobody believed in brought one of the largest deserts in China back from the edge of nothing. Let's start with what Maowusu actually is, because the name alone tells you something. In the Mongolian language, Maowusu means bad water. It sits in the Ordos Plateau, straddling the borders of Inner Mongolia, Shaanxi, and Ningxia in northern China. It covers roughly 40,000 square kilometers, an area larger than Switzerland. For most of the 20th century, that entire stretch was classified as a degraded, desertified zone, not a natural desert. That detail matters more than almost anything else in this story. The Maowusu was not born dead, it was made that way. 1,000 years ago, this region supported grasslands dense enough to feed the horses of Genghis Khan's cavalry. Historical records from the Tang dynasty, more than 12 centuries ago, describe rivers, wetlands, and forests across the Ordos. Nomadic herding cultures had moved through for millennia without breaking the land's skin. They followed cycles. They moved on before the grass ran out. That balance held, roughly, until the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when a combination of forces arrived at the same time and the land simply couldn't absorb all of them at once. Sedentary farming expanded north and west into land that wasn't built for the plow. Overgrazing intensified as population pressure removed the buffer that seasonal movement had always provided. Then came decades of political instability, then campaigns that pushed agricultural production at almost any ecological cost. By the mid-20th century, the grassland was retreating. By the 1980s, satellite imagery showed that the Maowusu had reached a tipping point. More than 8 out of every 10 hectares showed severe or extreme desertification. Towns like Yulin, on the desert's southern edge, were spending enormous resources just to keep the sand out of the streets. The desert was moving south at a measurable rate every year, and the standard response: build walls, plant isolated trees. Hope was not working. Here is where the story shifts, because what China eventually deployed in Maowusu was not a single dramatic intervention, it was a system. And the system had an animal at its center that almost no one in the West has heard about in this context. The Mongolian five-toed jerboa, the Mongolian gazelle, the great bustard, these were the charismatic species that had vanished from Maowusu as the land dried out. But the animal that would matter most to the restoration wasn't any of these. It was the plateau pika. And before that, at earlier phases of the project, the straw-colored central component was the humble rabbit, specifically farmed rabbits, released in coordinated waves across restoration zones as a tool of ecological priming. Let me explain what ecological priming means here, because this is the mechanism that separates what happened in Maowusu from simple tree planting campaigns. When you release large numbers of rabbits into a degraded landscape, they do 3 things simultaneously. They graze selectively, which in a counterintuitive way actually encourages certain grasses to spread rather than retreat, because those grasses evolved alongside grazing pressure and respond to it by tillering outward, multiplying at the root. They dig, their burrows aerate compacted soil, create micro-depressions where wind-blown seeds catch and hold, and in a landscape where the topsoil crust has been destroyed, That physical disruption is not a damage, it is an invitation. And they produce waste at scale. Across hundreds of thousands of release sites, the nutrient cycling that one rabbit generates is small. Across 800,000 animals distributed across a restoration grid, it becomes a biological input that starts to rebuild the soil microbiome that desertified land has lost. This was not improvised. The rabbit release programs, which unfolded in coordinated phases through the 2000s and 2010s, managed across county-level restoration bureaus in Shaanxi and Inner Mongolia, were one component of a larger framework that included the Grain for Green program, launched nationally in 1999, and a suite of regional desertification control policies that redirected hundreds of thousands of farming households away from marginal land and offered them financial incentives to plant native vegetation and leave the soil alone. Grain for Green is worth pausing on because it is one of the largest ecological restoration programs in human history, and it is still underreported in English-language media. According to data published by China's National Forestry and Grassland Administration and reviewed in multiple peer-reviewed assessments, Grain for Green enrolled more than 15 million households across China at its peak, converting sloped and fragile farmland back to forests and grassland. In the Loess Plateau and Maowusu regions specifically, a study published in Nature Sustainability in 2020 found that vegetation cover increased by more than 30% across the restoration zones over the preceding 2 decades. With soil erosion rates falling dramatically in the same period, the researchers attributed the recovery not primarily to rainfall variation they controlled for that, but to the land use change itself. But here is what the numbers don't capture, and this is the part that I think matters most. When the grasses came back, when the sedge and the native stipa and the artemisia species recolonized the stabilized sands, something else started coming back too, without being invited, or rather it came back because the invitation it needed wasn't a government policy. It was the smell of soil, the texture of roots in ground, the sound of insects in the evening. The raptors returned first, the upland buzzards and the rough-legged hawks that had nothing to hunt on bare sand. When the rabbits multiplied and the grassland emerged around them, the birds followed. The birds in turn controlled the rabbit population in the outer zones, preventing the overgrazing that had destroyed the land in the first place. Nobody planned that feedback loop. Or rather, somebody understood that if you provided the conditions, the feedback loops would assemble themselves. That understanding that ecology is not a machine you build, but a process you unblock is the intellectual hinge on which everything in Maowusu turns. And then there was the water. This is where the story stopped being a conservation story and became something larger. Desertified land doesn't just lose vegetation, it loses its capacity to hold rain. When a raindrop hits bare compacted sand, it doesn't infiltrate, it runs off, taking topsoil with it. When it hits a root network, even a sparse one, it slows, it filters down, it recharges the shallow aquifer. As the vegetation cover in Maowusu increased through the 2010s, monitoring stations across the region began recording something that the models had predicted, but that still felt surprising when it actually appeared in the data. The water table in parts of the restored zone was rising. Seasonal wetlands that had dried up decades earlier began to reappear, not everywhere, not uniformly, but enough that by 2019, local environmental authorities in Yulin Prefecture were documenting the return of standing water in locations where the land had been dry sand within living memory. There is a word in Chinese Maowusu that carries the weight of everything this place was: bad water, a name given in disappointment, in loss, and it survived, as place names do, long after the reality it described had changed. Now there is a growing conversation in China about whether Maowusu even qualifies as a desert anymore. The Chinese Academy of Sciences has weighed in carefully, noting that while the land use change is real and substantial, The underlying climate and soil conditions mean that without continued management, degradation could return. This is an important distinction. The restoration is real, it is also fragile, and the people who built it know that. The families who stayed in the restoration zones, the ones who took the grain for green payments and stopped plowing the slopes, became something that development economists don't have a clean category for. They became custodians of a landscape in recovery. Some of them, in oral history projects conducted by researchers from Lanzhou University, describe watching the land change across 10, 15, 20 years, not as a policy outcome, as a relationship. One farmer, quoted in a 2018 regional survey compiled by the Shaanxi Desertification Control Research Institute, described the moment he first saw a type of grass he hadn't seen since childhood appear at the edge of his former fields. He didn't know the scientific name. He knew what it meant. The land was breathing again. This is where I want to be precise about what this story is and what it isn't, because the framing matters. Maowusu is not a finished story. It is not a case where a government pressed a button, nature snapped back, and everyone went home satisfied. The restoration required sustained human effort, significant public investment, and the cooperation of hundreds of thousands of people who gave up short-term income for long-term land health. The plateau pika, the native gazelle, the great bustard, none of them are fully restored across the region. Some species that were present historically have not returned and may not, at least not without active reintroduction efforts that are still being debated. The edges of the green zone remain contested. Climate projections for Inner Asia include scenarios that could stress the restoration severely over the coming decades. But here is what is not debatable. Between 2000 and 2020, according to satellite-based vegetation assessments and ground truth monitoring published in peer-reviewed literature, including a landmark 2021 paper in the journal Science of the Total Environment, the proportion of Maowusu classified as severely desertified fell from over 70% to under 30%. In the same period, the sandstorm frequency affecting Yulin dropped by more than half. Crop yields in areas adjacent to restored zones improved as the buffer against wind erosion held. And in a political context where large-scale ecological restoration is often dismissed as impossible or incompatible with economic development, this landscape demonstrated that the two are not inherently opposed, that restoration at scale is achievable when the social and financial architecture supports it. 800,000 rabbits, a grass that looked like nothing, families told to stop farming land that was killing itself, a government program unpopular in its early years with the very communities it needed, and over 20 years, a desert the size of Switzerland began, improbably, tentatively, to remember what it had once been. The rabbits didn't restore Maowusu, but they primed the soil for something the soil already knew how to do. The grasses didn't restore Maowusu, but they held the ground long enough for the water to return. The water didn't restore Maowusu, but it called back the birds. And the birds, without a single planning document, began to regulate the system that humans had nudged back into motion. We didn't restore the landscape. We returned the conditions the landscape needed, and then slowly we got out of the way. I want to know what you think. Do you believe programs like this should be scaled up, more deliberate rewilding, more communities paid to step back and let the land recover? Leave your answer in the comments, because I'll read them. And the disagreements are as interesting as the agreements. If this story surprised you, share it with someone who needs to hear that not everything is going the wrong direction. And if you want more stories like this, the ones where the outcome wasn't guaranteed, where the recovery took longer than anyone planned, and where the land turned out to remember things we thought it had forgotten, there are more of these than you'd imagine, and I have many more to tell you. Soy Tom Marsh. Thank you for watching.